The story of the book of Ruth is more than a beautiful promise to Naomi. And the story in the book of Ruth is more than just a story of companionship or friendship. Ruth's story is a promise of commitment. It was a promise of service to Naomi. At this time in history in the Old Testament, it would have been customary for a widow like Ruth to marry another man within her family, most likely her brother-in-law, in order to sustain the family line. And if Ruth remarried within her own family, then she could still find protection within the family name of her husband. But as our text says, because of Naomi's age, it was unlikely, it was impossible that Naomi would have another husband and children that Ruth could marry. Again, all of the husbands died. So Naomi's request for Ruth and for her sister-in-law was to remain in Moab. And that was really the loving and compassionate thing for Naomi to say. We're told that Ruth was from Moab. It was her home. It's where she grew up. In fact, at the start of the book of Ruth, it tells us that Ruth's husband was from Bethlehem. But before her husband died, the reason Ruth and her husband moved back to Moab was because of a famine in the land. And so Ruth's promise to Naomi, where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. It was more than a promise of help. It was a commitment. It was service. And why is that true? Well, Naomi was an old woman without a husband and without a family to support her. So when Naomi would go back to Bethlehem after the famine, there was no home for her to go back to. And since she was a woman, she would not have work to do. There was no means of income for her. And because she couldn't bear children in that society, she would be completely dependent on the goodwill and the charity of others. Naomi would go home to be a beggar. There was no family farm to go back to. And so it's no wonder that Naomi encourages Ruth and Orpah to go back to their own Moabite home. And eventually Orpah does, right? She goes back to Moab, but not Ruth. Ruth, who is likely a young woman, a very beautiful woman, made a commitment to Naomi. A commitment to live basically with an old widow, even though they had no idea where they would live. Ruth made a commitment to help and to provide for her needs, to cook her food, to mend and to wash her clothes, to live in a home that was not her own. Ruth was willing to give up the promise of a brand new future with a new husband for a life of humble service to Naomi. So in every aspect, Ruth's decision to stay with Naomi, it was probably the wrong thing to do. But do you remember how God blessed Ruth's crazy, life-changing decision? Ruth said, "Where you go, I will go." So Ruth's commitment to her mother-in-law led her to go back to Bethlehem. In fact, if you remember, God's plan was to bless this Moabite woman so much that she would one day become the great-grandmother of a young man named David. David, a young man who would shepherd sheep around the hills of Bethlehem. David, a man who would grow to eventually become Israel's greatest king. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Ruth's decision to stay with her mother-in-law was a decision to stay. Where they eventually stayed was near a farm, a large farm filled with grain and wheat. And Ruth would go out as a beggar into the fields of that farm and gather wheat. And God eventually worked it out that one day she would meet a godly man named Boaz. He was actually the owner of that very farm in that field. He was a wealthy man that Ruth would later marry. Where you go, I will go. It was all part of God's plan that started with Ruth's humble service. Your people will be my people, Ruth said. Ruth was completely willing to let go of her family name and lineage, and she was willing to identify herself as a daughter of Bethlehem. She was completely unaware of what the future might bring. She was completely unaware of what security she might have as a Moabite woman among the people of Judah. But her humble service to her mother-in-law was enough. And finally, she says, your God will be my God. The Moabite god was a false god, an idol by the name of Chemosh. And they prayed to this idol, they prayed to this deity for prosperity and for wealth. So Ruth's decision to travel back to Bethlehem with her mother-in-law was all part of God's plan to bring the one true God into her heart and into her life through her husband Boaz. But even more amazingly, Ruth's decision to travel back to Bethlehem was also part of God's plan to bring her and her descendants into the very line of Jesus Christ, the Savior of the world. And so God not only blessed Ruth and her family through her decision, God blessed the whole world. He blessed you and me. So today, as we recall this beautiful story of commitment and service, you and I can be assured that God does the same through you and me today. God blesses our humble service in so many ways, just like Ruth's story, and in greater ways than we could possibly or ever imagine. And one of the many ways that you and I have the opportunity to make a commitment of humble service and to see what God can do because of it is by supporting and by volunteering and by going, just as Ruth did, and being part of our partner in ministry, Hope Renewed. This past November, Hope Renewed opened up their thrift store to serve God, to serve our church and school, and to serve our community in Shakopee and in the surrounding areas. And today we're going to hear a little bit more about Hope Renewed. We're going to hear from their leaders and how God can bless our humble service just as he blessed Ruth's.